Hello, everyone. Welcome to Sleep Space. Tonight, we will talk about the void people describe entering during a seizure or sudden blackout. It is one of those experiences that sits on the border between biology and mystery, a place where the brain's electrical storms intersect with the deepest questions about consciousness. For some, this void is terrifying. For others, it is peaceful. And for many, it is simply nothing. No memory, no sensation, no time. Yet even that nothing raises fascinating questions about what it means to be an aware being and how the brain can suspend the entire narrative of a life in an instant. As you settle in and let yourself relax, you're invited to explore this strange, in between territory, not as a medical lecture, but as a gentle journey into what the mind does when the lights go out. There is an interesting paradox here. When someone has a seizure, faints, or blacks out, the very thing experiencing the event, consciousness, often isn't present to record it. People describe waking on the floor or opening their eyes in an ambulance with a sense of having slipped out of the world entirely. They know time has passed only because their environment has changed. Maybe paramedics are kneeling beside them. Maybe a crowd has gathered. Maybe a friend is shaking their shoulder. But the internal timeline is gone, replaced by a gap that cannot be filled, and that gap is precisely what makes it so intriguing. We often think of consciousness as a continuous stream. Even when we sleep, dreaming, or drifting, there is usually a sense of flow, one moment giving rise to the next, even if the transitions are strange or fragmented, but a blackout breaks the chain. It is not like falling asleep because falling asleep has stages. You feel yourself fade, the world softens. There is a gradient, a dissolving. A blackout, especially one caused by a seizure, is more abrupt, like a circuit being cut. One moment you are present, thinking, perceiving, navigating the world. The next moment, everything disappears without warning, without farewell, and without memory. This raises an almost frighteningly deep question. What happens to you when the brain can no longer hold the structure that produces the sense of you? To understand the nature of this void, it helps to start with electrical activity in the brain. During certain kinds of seizures, especially generalized seizures, huge groups of neurons begin firing together in what might be described as synchronized chaos. Normally, neurons communicate in intricate patterns, forming networks that allow you to think, move, feel, and remain aware. But when those networks fire in a storm, awareness doesn't simply get distorted, it gets drowned out. It is like trying to hear a single violin in the middle of a thunderclap. The awareness is still attempting to exist, but the noise of neural overload makes it impossible. This means the void is not a place in the ordinary sense. It is not a hallway you pass through or a dreamlike landscape you forget upon waking. It is the absence of experience entirely. The machinery required to generate consciousness has stalled. Yet the strange part is that people often describe it as if they went somewhere. They say they were pulled into darkness, or they slipped away, or they were floating. But these descriptions happen after the fact. They are interpretations built from the perspective of waking up into confusion. Imagine you are reading a book. You turn a page, and suddenly several pages are blank. You don't remember turning them. You don't remember choosing to skip them. They are simply gone. That is what a blackout can feel like. Except instead of pages in a book, it is pages in the story of yourself. But what if we try to approach it from another angle? Instead of thinking of the void as emptiness, what if it is a boundary? A threshold where consciousness can no longer track itself, but something deeper is still happening under the surface? After all, the brain does not shut down entirely during a seizure. Processes continue: breathing, heart rhythm, reflexes, and internal signaling. It is not death, it is disruption. So perhaps the void is more like stepping outside your own timeline. For you, there is no time passing, but for everyone else, time flows normally. People who have undergone anesthesia describe something similar: the sense of instantaneous waking. No passage of time, no memory, no transition, but the difference is that anesthesia is controlled, designed to switch off specific aspects of awareness. A seizure is not orderly. It is abrupt, forceful, and unpredictable. Yet the conscious experience, or lack of one, shares a striking similarity. You flicker out, then back in. This raises a profound philosophical question. If consciousness can blink out so easily, is it something fragile that emerges only when the brain is perfectly stable? Or is it something more durable that simply loses its connection to the physical world for a moment? Some people who experience seizures describe a brief moment of warning, auras, flashes of light, changes in sound, or an odd sense of familiarity or dread. This prelude adds another layer of curiosity. Is the warning a final spark of awareness as the storm builds? Or is it the brain's attempt to communicate that something dramatic is about to occur? And when the seizure ends, people often wake in a fog. Some remember fragments, others remember nothing at all. The void itself, the actual absence, cannot be remembered, but the edges around it, right before losing consciousness and right after regaining it, often feel strangely charged. People report feeling like they are returning from somewhere far away, even though that somewhere had no content. It is as though the brain, upon rebooting, tries to make sense of the gap using metaphors. And this is where the mystery deepens. If your brain cannot record any experience during the blackout, does that mean the self ceases to exist for that entire duration? One way to explore this is to think of consciousness as the surface of a lake. When conditions are calm, the surface reflects the world, showing clear images and steady continuity. But during a seizure, the lake churns violently. The reflection disappears. But the water itself, the deeper structure of the mind, remains. When the storm stops, the surface returns and the reflection comes back. You feel like yourself again. The you did not vanish, but your ability to experience yourself temporarily collapsed. This model suggests the void is not death or nothingness, but a distortion so intense that conscious experience cannot form. You are not gone. You are simply unable to be present. However, there is another angle worth exploring, one that people often hesitate to discuss because it touches something uncomfortable. The possibility that consciousness is not as continuous or stable as we believe. We like to think we are always there, always aware, always present. But the existence of these voids, these blank stretches of time, suggests that our sense of self may be more fragile than we imagine. If the right electrical pattern collapses, the story stops. And when the pattern returns, the story resumes, with no awareness of interruption. Yet despite this fragility, we persist. Our identity reassembles. We wake up, confused perhaps, but still ourselves. The resilience is remarkable. It hints that consciousness might be an emergent property with built-in fail-safes, capable of reforming after disruption. Some individuals who experience blackouts or seizures report moments of dreamlike imagery right before or right after the void. A flash of light, a feeling of falling, a tunnel, a sense of being watched. Scientists often interpret these as neural misfires, random activity or abrupt shifts in the visual cortex, but others see them as symbolic, representing the mind's attempt to process the unprocessable. When continuity is lost, the mind reaches for imagery to fill the emotional space created by confusion. And there is another layer, the emotional dimension. Blackouts can be frightening, especially for people who do not understand what is happening to them. Losing time challenges our fundamental sense of reality. We rely on memory and continuity to understand who we are. When those break down, even briefly, we confront something primal, the realization that our awareness is not guaranteed. Yet some individuals describe the void as peaceful, even comforting. They say it felt like floating, like silence, like warmth. They don't remember content, but the absence was not frightening. It was as if the brain produced a gentle afterglow upon waking, a soft landing. So perhaps the void is not one experience but many, shaped by the brain state surrounding it, the emotional context, and the individual's relationship to their own awareness. As you settle in tonight, consider the possibility that consciousness is not a straight line, but a series of flickers, moments connected by memory, perception, and story. The void between them is not something to fear, but something to observe with curiosity. It shows us that awareness is precious precisely because it is not guaranteed, because it depends on a delicate balance of biology and mystery. When trying to understand what happens inside the mind during a blackout, it's tempting to rely entirely on the brain's physical explanations: electrical storms, temporary disruptions of neural circuits, metabolic drops. These are all real and important, but they don't fully capture the lived experience of losing time. Biology can explain the mechanism, but it cannot fully explain the subjective strangeness that follows. This is why so many people describe waking from a seizure or fainting spell in a way that feels almost like returning from an uncharted territory. Rationally, they know nothing happened. There were no dreams, no thoughts, but emotionally, it feels like they have crossed an unseen boundary. To approach this more deeply, consider what awareness really is. We experience it as a constant presence, but in truth, awareness is stitched together from countless tiny processes: sensory input, memory formation, emotional regulation, bodily awareness. All of these feed into the feeling of being a continuous self. When any piece of that machinery falters, the sense of continuity weakens. A seizure or sudden blackout is not merely a disruption, it is a temporary collapse of the scaffolding that holds the sense of I am here. And when the scaffolding drops, the experience afterward can feel uncanny, as though you've momentarily slipped out of the physical world. One idea that emerges across countless reports is the sense of disorientation upon waking, not confusion in the everyday sense, like forgetting where you put your keys, but a deeper kind of disorientation. People describe feeling as though they were plucked out of one moment and placed into another without experiencing the bridge between them. If you imagine reality as a film, it is as though a few frames have been cut out. You resume on the next frame without knowing what happened in the missing sequence. This creates a strange psychological effect. You know you should have a memory, and you feel its absence. The shape of the gap is noticeable, even if its content is not. This phenomenon is sometimes called temporal discontinuity. It is the mind's realization that something is missing from the internal timeline. And what's fascinating is that the mind reacts to this absence. Even when the gap is supposed to be empty, the brain still tries to make sense of it, scanning for a narrative, a sensation, something to cling to. That search is what creates the illusion that the void is a place, but it isn't a place at all. It's the awareness of an absence, the mind encountering its own inability to fill in the fragment. Certain individuals attempt to describe the void in metaphorical terms. Some say it felt like floating beneath a dark ocean. Others say it felt like being swallowed by silence. Others describe it as a jump cut, like flipping to the next chapter without reading the pages in between. But all of these metaphors point to one thing: humans struggle to conceptualize nothingness. Consciousness is built to perceive, interpret, remember, anticipate. Even when presented with an actual blank gap, it tries to turn the gap into something. This is why the void often feels mysterious, even when, biologically, it is simply the disappearance of experience. Another dimension worth exploring is what happens to the sense of time during these episodes. When someone blacks out, time technically passes, but subjectively, it does not. For the person experiencing it, the gap is instantaneous. There is no stretching, no dreaming, no drifting. It is as though the entire period has been removed from the timeline. But for observers, time behaves normally. They watch the person fall, seize, lie still, or convulse. Minutes may go by, voices may rise, Actions occur, but for the one experiencing the blackout, those minutes do not exist. This creates an eerie disconnect. Time moves without you. Your story continues without your awareness. When you return, you are reinserted into a world that kept going, and this realization can be deeply unsettling because it reveals how dependent our sense of self is on the continuous participation of awareness. The brain, however, is not concerned with philosophy during these moments. It is focused on survival, regulating the heartbeat, keeping oxygen flowing, trying to restore equilibrium. When the storm passes and consciousness returns, it does so gradually, even if it feels sudden. The brain has to rebuild the networks that generate awareness. This may happen quickly, but it is not instantaneous. This rebuilding is why many people wake from a blackout feeling foggy, slow, or emotionally raw. The emotional center of the brain often remains activated after a seizure, creating a sense of vulnerability or fear. But interestingly, some people wake up feeling strangely calm, as though the void carried a softness with it. This emotional afterglow can shape how a person interprets the experience. If the return is gentle, the void may seem peaceful. If the return is chaotic, the void may seem threatening. It's also worth noting that not all blackouts are the same. Fainting spells, for example, often involve the brain losing blood flow temporarily. Seizures involve abnormal electrical activity. Alcohol or trauma-induced blackouts involve disruptions in memory encoding rather than consciousness itself. Despite these differences, the subjective result, a gap, feels similar. The mechanism varies, but the effect on the continuity of experience is shared. What unites all of these is the loss of access to the internal narrative. Consciousness depends on ongoing recording. Without recording, the narrative breaks, and the moment the narrative breaks, the sense of being a stable self is challenged. Some people describe this challenge as frightening. Others describe it as humbling. Some even describe it as intriguing, as though they have peeked at the underlying fragility of awareness. Another layer worth exploring is how people interpret the void culturally or spiritually. Throughout history, sudden losses of consciousness have been seen through many lenses. In some cultures, seizures were interpreted as messages from gods or spirits. In others, they were seen as evidence of a person being inhabited by something greater than themselves. While modern neuroscience provides clearer explanations, the emotional weight of these experiences still leads some individuals to describe them in mystical terms. When you wake from a blackout and feel as though you were gone, it's natural to wonder where you went, even if rationally you know you went nowhere. Some people report a sense of having had a profound experience despite remembering nothing. This may come from the mind trying to reconcile the abrupt return to awareness. If your consciousness disappears and then reappears without warning, the reappearance may feel significant. The brain may interpret that significance as meaning something happened, even if the void itself contained nothing. We can examine the existential implications of this as well. The void challenges the assumption that consciousness is always present. It forces us to confront the possibility that awareness is intermittent. We disappear and reappear constantly. During sleep, during daydreams, during moments of dissociation. But seizures and blackouts are unique because the disappearance is total. There is no hidden dream world, no wandering thoughts. There is only the absence of experience. This leads to an interesting philosophical question. Does consciousness require continuity to remain the same consciousness? If you vanish for 10 minutes and then return with no memory of the interruption, are you the same you as before? Most people instinctively answer yes. After all, your personality remains. Your memories before the blackout remain. Your body remains. But if you think carefully, the continuity of identity relies heavily on the assumption that your awareness moves through time without interruption. When that assumption is broken, even briefly, it raises the possibility that the you who wakes up is a newly constructed version, similar to the one before. but rebuilt from memory and habit rather than uninterrupted presence. This idea isn't meant to be unsettling. In fact, it can be reassuring. If consciousness is something that can restart, that means it is resilient. It means the mind can reconstruct itself even after the deepest silence. And the reconstruction is nearly seamless. You return to your thoughts, your preferences, your sense of humor, your values. The continuity feels intact even though you know a piece is missing. This ability to rebuild suggests that the core of who you are may not depend on moment-to-moment awareness, but on the underlying architecture that holds your memories and personality. There is a quiet beauty in this idea. It suggests that even when awareness disappears completely, the essence of the self persists. The mind is capable of falling into darkness and rising again without losing the thread of its identity. But the void also highlights something else: the temporary nature of experience. Everything we know, everything we feel, everything we perceive is part of a delicate interplay between the brain and consciousness. And when that interplay is disrupted, the entire experiential world collapses instantly. This doesn't diminish the value of experience, it enhances it. The fact that awareness is fragile makes it precious. The fact that it can disappear makes its presence more meaningful. People who have gone through blackouts sometimes describe becoming more reflective afterward. Not always in dramatic ways, but in subtle shifts. They become more attuned to how strange and remarkable it is to be conscious at all, to be aware, to perceive, to think. This isn't something we usually contemplate. Awareness feels automatic, but when you confront a moment of total absence, you begin to appreciate the miracle of presence. The void also offers a rare look at the boundary between self and non-self. When you are unconscious, the world continues without you. The people around you move, speak, react. Time flows. Events unfold, and yet, in your internal world, nothing happens. It is a demonstration that reality is not dependent on your observation of it. The universe does not pause when you do. This realization can feel disorienting, but it can also be grounding. It shows how deeply interconnected we are with everything around us, yet how small our personal perspective is within the larger flow of time. To explore this mysterious territory more deeply, it helps to look at how the brain reconstructs reality after a period of unconsciousness. When someone wakes from a blackout, whether caused by seizure, fainting, or another event, the world often feels unfamiliar for a brief moment. Not because the environment has changed, but because the person's relationship to it has been interrupted. This interruption creates a cognitive gap the brain instinctively tries to fill, even though the blackout leaves nothing to work with. This attempt to reassemble the world can feel surreal. People often describe sensations of déjà vu, disorientation, or an odd sense that the world is somehow thinner, as though reality has lost a layer of familiarity. These reactions come from the brain rapidly re-establishing its internal map, its sense of space, time, and self. Think of it like rebooting a complex computer. For a few moments after restarting, processes lag, windows load slowly, and connections re-establish one by one. The mind does something similar. It boots back into awareness, piecing together sensory input, memory, emotional stability, and orientation. This rebuilding process gives rise to another puzzling phenomenon: the feeling of having been somewhere, even though the void itself contains no experience. This sensation may be a side effect of the brain trying to reconcile the abrupt jump in time. When awareness returns, the brain expects a continuous thread of experience. When it doesn't find one, it attempts to create a narrative that explains the gap. And because the brain cannot form memories during a blackout, it tries to work backward from the point of waking. The result is a peculiar emotional trace, an impression without content, like the shadow of a forgotten dream. This shadow becomes especially pronounced after longer seizures or blackouts. Some people describe waking up with a sense of awe or dread. Not dread of what happened externally, but dread tied to the absence itself. It is not fear of memory, it is fear of no memory. This emotional reaction is deeply human. The mind grapples with the idea that for a span of time, the self was not present. It's not a physical threat, it's an existential one. To understand why these emotional reactions run so deep, it helps to remember that human beings rely on continuity to anchor their identity. We define ourselves by our histories, our thoughts, the sequence of events that form the story of our lives. Interrupt that sequence, especially without warning, and the brain instinctively perceives it as a disruption to the narrative structure of the self. Even if the person is physically unharmed, the brief collapse in continuity can feel like something fundamental was shaken. But even more intriguing is the idea that the brain doesn't just lose time during these episodes, it also loses the ability to distinguish between was and was not. During a blackout, nothing is recorded. There is no sensory input, no emotional processing, and no internal monologue. And yet, upon waking, the mind has to reconcile this blank space with the expectation of experience. It knows something should be there, but there is nothing to grasp. This distinction, knowing that something should exist while simultaneously knowing that it doesn't, is what makes the void so unique. Another interesting aspect is how differently people describe their return to awareness. Some say it feels like rising to the surface of water. Others say it feels like snapping back from somewhere far away. Others describe a sudden switching on, like a light bulb flickering back to life. These descriptions hint at the many ways consciousness reactivates, sometimes gradually, sometimes abruptly, but always in a way that feels slightly foreign, because the usual continuity is missing. One question people often ask after experiencing a blackout is whether any part of them remained conscious during the void. The answer is complex biologically. The systems responsible for awareness shut down or derailed in such a way that conscious experience cannot form. But that does not necessarily mean the deeper mechanisms of the brain, the machinery that keeps the body alive, stopped functioning. Breathing continues, reflexes remain. Sensory information may still reach the brain even if it is not processed into conscious awareness. So while the conscious you is absent, the biological organism persists. This creates a layered concept of existence. Part of you remains active even when the part that experiences the world has vanished. This layered existence raises an intriguing philosophical point. If consciousness is not present, but the body continues, is the self still present? Most people would say yes, because identity is more than awareness. But the experience of waking from the void challenges this assumption. If you cannot experience yourself, if you cannot think or feel or perceive during the gap, then what does it mean to say you existed in that period? The question may not have a definitive answer, but it opens the door to reflecting on the nature of identity itself. Another dimension of this experience involves the relationship between sensory input and consciousness. During a blackout, sensory pathways may still activate. Light may reach the eyes. Sound may reach the ears. Touch may activate nerve receptors. But without awareness, these signals cannot be interpreted. They happen, but they are not experienced. This disconnect shows just how essential the conscious component is to perception. Your senses alone do not create your reality. It is the interpretation, the awareness of those senses that forms the conscious world. Without that awareness, sensation does not become experience. It remains raw data with no observer. Some people who faint briefly describe faint echoes of sensation, a ringing sound, a flash of light, a feeling of falling. These may represent the last moments before consciousness dissolves, or the first moments during its return, but they do not represent the void itself because the void has no content. What they represent is the boundary, the line where experience fades out or flickers back in. These boundaries are fascinating because they provide the closest viewpoint into the process of consciousness dissolving and reassembling. One particularly interesting phenomenon occurs in people who experience absent seizures. These are brief interruptions, sometimes only a few seconds, during which the person stops responding. They may stare blankly, they may pause mid-sentence, but when the seizure ends, they often have no memory of the interruption. For them, the void is not dramatic, it's subtle, slipping unnoticed between moments. What this reveals is that conscious awareness can vanish while the external world continues almost seamlessly. It shows that consciousness is not a static field, but a dynamic state that can flicker unexpectedly. This flickering raises intriguing possibilities about the true nature of awareness. What if consciousness is less like a continuous stream and more like a rapidly updated construct, a frame-by-frame rendering of experience? During a seizure or blackout, the rendering process collapses. The frames stop. When the process restarts, the mind resumes generating the experience of continuity, even though a chunk of time is missing. This perspective might help explain why the void feels like nothing, because it is a break in the rendering of subjective reality. Some neuroscientists propose that awareness is the product of communication between different regions of the brain. If those regions fall out of sync, consciousness cannot form. During seizures, the synchronization becomes chaotic, preventing the formation of coherent experience. This theory aligns with reports of people waking from seizures feeling as though they were pulled out of a storm, because that is exactly what was happening inside their brains. The electrical activity was too chaotic to support awareness. Yet not all seizures feel chaotic to the person experiencing them. Some report peacefulness before losing consciousness. Some describe a sensation of release or warmth. This contrast shows that subjective experience depends heavily on where in the brain the disruption occurs. If emotional centers activate, the experience may feel overwhelming. If they do not, the transition may feel neutral or even comforting. But regardless of how the transition feels, the void itself remains empty. Another layer worth considering is how memory interacts with these events. Memory is not just a recording device, it is an interpretive process. When someone wakes from a blackout, they do not simply access a missing file. They confront the absence itself, and the brain doesn't like gaps. It tries to explain them. It might create fleeting impressions. It might generate emotional responses. It might even produce dreams-like fragments that feel connected to the event even though they occurred after waking. These fragments can lead people to believe they experienced something during the void, but in most cases, the fragments are created during recovery, not during unconsciousness. They are misinterpreted as part of the blackout because the timeline feels jumbled. This misinterpretation is another reminder of how heavily consciousness relies on narrative. Without narrative, experience becomes confusing. When the narrative breaks, the brain tries to create new material to close the gap. This brings us to the emotional aftershocks. People who experience blackouts often grapple with a sense of vulnerability afterward. Not physical vulnerability, but existential vulnerability. The realization that consciousness is not as solid or permanent as it feels. This realization can be unsettling, but for some, it can also be transformative. It can open a sense of curiosity about the nature of awareness. It can highlight how remarkable it is to experience anything at all. The fragility of consciousness can deepen appreciation for its presence. Some individuals describe feeling more connected to life after experiencing the void, not less. They say the interruption helped them recognize how precious awareness is. Others feel the opposite. They become more cautious, more protective of their sense of stability. Both reactions make sense. The void is not something we are built to understand easily, and encountering it can shift perspectives in unexpected ways. What makes the void so compelling is not just that it interrupts consciousness, but that it forces a confrontation with a fundamental mystery: why consciousness exists in the first place. The brain is an organ made of cells and electrical signals, yet from this physical structure emerges something intangible: the experience of being alive, aware, present. When that awareness collapses, even briefly, it highlights the delicate balance required to sustain it. The void reminds us that consciousness is not a given. It is a phenomenon that emerges from complexity and can collapse when that complexity falters. And yet, it also shows that consciousness is resilient. It disappears and returns, reassembling itself as though nothing happened. The self reforms. The world regains shape. The story continues. One of the most intriguing aspects of losing consciousness is what happens right before the void forms and right after it dissolves. These boundary moments are incredibly rich, not because they contain clear memories, but because they offer a glimpse of how consciousness unravels and reassembles. Many people describe a sudden shift, a sense of distortion, a wave of dizziness, a sound fading into the distance, or a feeling of detachment before everything disappears. These sensations are often interpreted as meaningful, even though they are simply the mind's last moments of trying to maintain awareness as its foundations begin to collapse. In those final seconds, the brain is still attempting to function normally. It tries to gather sensory input, interpret it, and respond. But as the disruption intensifies, whether from an electrical surge during a seizure, a sudden loss of blood flow, or a metabolic drop, the brain cannot keep up. The systems responsible for self-awareness flicker. The sense of spatial orientation dissolves. Time begins to lose structure. And then, without a transition, the void replaces everything. The transition is always abrupt, because the brain doesn't ease into unconsciousness the way it does in sleep. Sleep has stages, rhythms, and a soft descent. Losing consciousness from a blackout or seizure is more like the sudden halting of a machine. One moment, the system is functional. The next, it is offline. This abruptness is part of what makes waking up from these episodes feel so disorienting. The suddenness of the shutdown is mirrored by the suddenness of the return. When awareness returns, it does not come as a coherent whole. Instead, it arrives in fragments, sensations, sounds, the feeling of one's body, the recognition of faces, the need to breathe deeply. Each fragment appears like a puzzle piece, and the brain tries to assemble them into something meaningful. This reassembly can take anywhere from moments to hours, depending on the individual and the cause of the blackout. But regardless of duration, the experience of rebuilding is often confusing. The mind tries to grasp at continuity, to understand how it jumped from one moment to the next with nothing in between. In these first moments of return, the sense of self can feel weakened, as though you are observing your own mind from a distance. Some people describe feeling temporarily unfamiliar with their surroundings, even places they have been countless times. Others describe feeling emotionally raw, as though all their defenses have been lowered. This vulnerability is not a sign of danger, but a sign that the brain is still reconnecting the systems responsible for grounding the self. One of the most fascinating questions is whether the sense of time itself resumes immediately, or whether it takes a moment for the brain to re-establish the flow. For some people, time appears all at once. They wake, and the world feels instantly real and structured. For others, time feels suspended for a few seconds, as though they are catching up to a reality that continued without them. In these moments, reality can feel more dreamlike than solid. Colours might seem brighter or dimmer. Sounds might echo strangely. Even the sensation of breathing might feel different, as though the body has been operating without the awareness that normally accompanies it. This mismatch between physical continuity and experiential discontinuity is one of the central mysteries of the void. The body continued functioning. The world continued moving. But the awareness that ties these together was absent. When awareness returns, it tries to reconcile the body's uninterrupted function with its own absence. The result is an experience that feels both familiar and foreign at the same time. A world that makes sense and yet feels slightly altered. It is important to consider how much of this experience is shaped by memory. Memory is not a passive recording of events. It is an active process that shapes how we interpret reality. When someone wakes from a blackout, they try to match what they are perceiving with what they expect to remember. When the memory is missing, the mind experiences a brief moment of cognitive dissonance. Something happened, but there is no internal record. This tension contributes to the feeling that the void was something, even though it was the absence of experience. Another significant factor is the emotional tone of the return. People often describe waking up with intense emotions that seem disconnected from any specific memory: fear, confusion, relief, sadness, anger, or even calmness. These emotions might arise from the brain's heightened state of arousal after a seizure, or from the adrenaline released during fainting. They might also be the first sensations the mind becomes aware of as it attempts to rebuild its sense of presence. Interestingly, some individuals describe these emotional reactions as clues to what the void felt like, even though the void itself has no feeling. The brain, searching for continuity, sometimes misattributes post blackout emotions to the experience of the blackout itself. A person who wakes up distressed may later believe the void was frightening. A person who wakes up calm may interpret the void as peaceful. But these interpretations are reflections of the return, not the absence. This distinction highlights an important feature of consciousness. It needs narrative. Without narrative, emotions and sensations become unanchored. The mind instinctively tries to create context, even in the absence of actual experience. This narrative instinct is what transforms the void into something more mysterious than it actually is. People may feel as though they drifted through a dark space or entered another realm, not because they did, but because the mind is trying to make sense of the sudden jump. Yet despite the brain's attempts to generate meaning, the void remains a unique phenomenon precisely because it defies interpretation. It is not like dreaming, where images arise and dissolve. It is not like sleep, where you gradually disconnect from the world. It is not like meditation, where awareness shifts into stillness. It is not even like anesthesia, where consciousness is intentionally suppressed. The void is a disruption, an enforced absence where the machinery of consciousness temporarily fails. And this failure reveals how finely tuned and vulnerable the experience of awareness really is. But vulnerability is only half the story. There is also resilience. The fact that consciousness can disappear completely and then rebuild itself is remarkable. It means the systems responsible for generating the self are flexible enough to recover from chaos. It also suggests that consciousness is not a fragile flame that sputters out at the slightest disturbance. It is more like a process, one that can pause and resume as long as the underlying structures remain intact. This resilience is often overlooked because the experience of the void feels so disruptive. But the mere fact that people wake up, regain orientation, and continue with their lives is evidence of how robust the mind truly is. Even after the deepest absence, the self returns. The personality remains. The memories remain. The sense of identity resurfaces. What disappears is the continuity, not the essence. Exploring this further brings us to the question of whether consciousness is an all or nothing state. Are you either fully conscious or not at all? Or is there a spectrum with varying degrees of awareness? Science suggests a spectrum. Consciousness likely arises from networks of brain activity working together in specific ways. When those networks falter, awareness can partially or fully dissolve. Blackouts represent a point on the extreme end of this spectrum, a moment where the networks fail so completely that awareness cannot form. But the return to consciousness likely occurs gradually, even if it feels instantaneous. There may be brief moments where awareness flickers before fully re-engaging. These flickers might not be remembered, because memory systems are not yet active, but they suggest that the boundary between the void and wakefulness is more complex than it appears. It is not a simple switch. It is a transition, invisible to the person experiencing it, because the systems responsible for experience are not yet fully online. This brings us to the idea of the observer. When you wake from a blackout, there is a moment where you become the observer again, aware of your surroundings, your thoughts, your body. Before that moment, there is no observer, and yet the body remains active. This separation between the observer and the organism raises profound questions about the relationship between consciousness and physical existence. It suggests that the observer is not the entirety of who we are, but a layer built upon deeper biological processes. Understanding this separation can be comforting. It means that even when consciousness disappears, the body's fundamental processes continue. Life continues. The self is able to return because the structure that supports it persists beneath the surface. At the same time, the absence of the observer can feel unsettling. We are accustomed to experiencing life through awareness. To realize that life can continue without awareness challenges our assumptions about what it means to exist. But this challenge can lead to deeper reflection. It can inspire awe at the complexity of the mind. It can highlight how fragile and extraordinary it is to experience anything at all. There's a moment in these blackout accounts where people talk about something strangely paradoxical. The sense of rapid transition paired with the certainty that no time passed at all. It's as if the mind flips a switch, but the mechanism behind that switch remains hidden. Part of what makes this topic so compelling is that it forces us to consider how fragile continuity really is, how the brain stitches reality together, how it maintains the illusion of smoothness, and how quickly that can be lost. When that stitching fails, even for a heartbeat, the result feels like falling into a gap that shouldn't exist. One reason these abrupt transitions feel so eerie is because consciousness normally functions like a running narrative. You experience life as a steady stream, but the brain is actually doing a constant balancing act, buffering, filtering, and predicting input milliseconds before you're even aware of it. When a seizure interrupts that flow, or when the brain loses its ability to predict and process incoming signals, the narrative collapses. Not gradually, but instantly, like a film reel that runs out of frames. The lights don't dim, they just go out. This sudden shut-off helps explain why people don't usually remember the moment consciousness fails. The brain doesn't store information properly during that transition. Without memory, there's no bridge between one moment and the next. So the mind perceives it as a plunge across a blank gap, even if the body is experiencing something chaotic, loud, or distressing. Meanwhile, the person inside feels nothing at all. It's one of the strangest experiences reported. Your body may be in crisis, but you, as an observer, aren't present for it. Some researchers compare this to the way dreams work. In a dream, time passes, events unfold, conversations happen, but the brain constructs them all dynamically based on fragments of memory, emotion, sensation, and pattern. During a blackout or seizure, the brain also constructs, but in a very different way. It reconstructs nothing. It refuses to play the usual role of narrator. The world doesn't stop, but your internal witness does. And when the witness steps away, the scene becomes unrecorded, unperceived, unexperienced. But what makes this even more fascinating is the rare but striking exception. The small number of people who report something in the void, not memories of the physical world, but impressions, fleeting images, disembodied sensations, strange colours or sounds that don't behave like anything from waking life. Some describe these impressions as if they're watching the scattered sparks of a machine shutting down. A few describe sensations of being pulled or drifting. Others feel as though they are floating in a dark, weightless chamber where time doesn't exist. These impressions could be fragments of sensory input that slipped into awareness before the blackout fully took hold, or after the brain began rebooting. But what makes them mysterious is that they don't feel like dreams. They feel isolated, unanchored, and often deeply unfamiliar. They don't follow the logic of dreams. They don't contain narrative. Instead, they feel like static, blips of raw consciousness, unshaped by memory or thought. Neuroscientists suspect these rare experiences may come from activity in the sensory cortex or visual centers as they're losing synchrony. Before the seizure fully overtakes the brain, neural networks may fire in irregular, chaotic bursts. These bursts could create flashes of internal imagery or phantom sensations, because the brain is in the process of shutting down the integrative functions that place sensory information in context. Those fragments aren't woven into a story, they just appear, stark and isolated. It's almost like seeing individual pixels rather than the picture they usually create. But the truly mind-bending question is this: if the brain is losing control, why are these fragments sometimes remembered so clearly afterward? You would expect them to be erased along with all other memory formation, yet some people describe these moments with striking vividness. One possibility is that these impressions don't come from the moment before the blackout, but from the moment the mind begins coming back online. The brain might be generating a burst of activity as consciousness resurfaces, creating sensations that feel otherworldly simply because the system isn't organized yet. Think of it like a computer starting up in slow motion, flashing fragments of code or shapes before the full interface loads. You still won't remember the period during the blackout, but you might remember the moment your awareness attempts to return. Another layer of mystery appears in people who describe the return from the void as abrupt but accompanied by a strong physical jolt. They say it feels like being dropped back into their body from a great height. There's no falling sensation beforehand, just the impact of re-entry. This can happen because the body and brain are usually out of sync during and after a seizure. Muscles may be tense or shaking. Breathing may be uneven. Sensory information floods in all at once. When consciousness snaps back, it's landing inside a moving, unstable system. That collision between awareness and physical disarray can feel like being slammed into reality. There's also the emotional component. Many people describe the awakening as extremely confusing. It's common to not recognize faces, surroundings, or even personal details for several minutes. This is a state called postictal confusion, and it happens because the brain is still trying to re-establish order among networks that have just gone through intense electrical disturbance. Memory, orientation, and emotional regulation take longer to stabilize than simple awareness. So when consciousness returns, it arrives before clarity does. The result is a moment that feels both present and disconnected. Yet despite all this complexity, the person who experienced the blackout has no sense of the physical or emotional turmoil their body went through. To them, it's like teleporting from one instant to another. They might be lying on the ground, surrounded by paramedics, or sitting upright with a pounding headache, but the inner experience is identical. The previous moment was simply removed. This raises a question that many people find unsettling. If the brain can delete entire segments of a person's experience without them ever noticing, how much of what we call life is built on just the moments we remember? And how much of our identity depends on continuity that we assume is constant but is actually fragile? One of the strangest accounts comes from individuals who experience seizures during sleep. These events happen while the rest of the mind is already in an altered state, yet even then, the blackout portion remains distinct. People often describe waking up with an acute sense that something occurred, but with no perception of what it was. They may remember fragments of dreams, but the seizure portion is blank. It creates a strange contrast. Dreams can be bizarre, fragmented, and surreal, but they still feel like experiences. The void after a seizure doesn't feel like anything. It's an absence that exists alongside other mental content but remains inaccessible. Another question worth exploring is whether time exists within that absence. Some people say they feel as though it lasted no time at all. Others describe a faint impression that something prolonged happened, even though they can't articulate what. One explanation is that the brain may retain a kind of non-conscious record, a physiological sense of duration without memory. It's similar to how you don't remember being unconscious during anesthesia, but still wake up with the sense that time passed. The body registers cycles of regulation, energy expenditure, or stress, and this creates an impression of duration that lingers without memory. There's also a possibility that people's internal sense of time becomes distorted upon waking. If recovery feels difficult or disorienting, the mind might interpret that as evidence of a longer gap. This creates a strange illusion. The length of the void feels tied to the difficulty of re entry, not the actual duration. But whether the void feels short or long, the common thread is that it never feels like an experience in the usual sense. It's a break in the chain, not just a missing link, and it's that break, the total absence of continuity, that leaves people unsettled long after the event. It forces them to confront an uncomfortable truth. Consciousness isn't a steady flame, but a flickering one, easily extinguished and reignited. This can completely change how a person views their own mind. Some describe feeling more aware of how fragile their awareness is. Others say the experience made them more introspective, tuning in to subtle shifts in sensation or attention. And some even describe it as freeing, a reminder that consciousness isn't something to take for granted, that it's something dynamic and mysterious. The experiences surrounding blackouts and seizures also raise questions about the relationship between memory and identity. If memory can be removed so completely, if hours or minutes can vanish without leaving any trace, then what does that mean for the idea that experience shapes who we are? Are we the sum of everything we've lived through, or only the things we remember? This is one of the most debated questions in consciousness research. Some scientists argue that identity is built on memory, not experience itself. Others believe experience leaves physiological or emotional imprints even without memory. And some propose that the self is something that exists independently of both, an underlying continuity that persists even when consciousness drops out. Blackouts challenge all three theories. They show that memory can fail entirely, even while the body continues acting. They show that experience without awareness is possible, and they show that continuity can be interrupted without destroying the sense of self. When a person wakes up from a seizure, they immediately feel like themselves, even with no memory of the missing time. Identity reasserts itself as soon as consciousness returns, as if it was waiting in the background. This creates a fascinating possibility. Maybe identity isn't stored moment to moment, but is an ongoing process that restarts whenever the brain can support it. Maybe the self is a program that boots up when conditions allow, loading the most essential components first: recognition, orientation, the feeling of being you. The missing pieces, including the blackout, simply don't load. What makes this topic so compelling isn't just the science, but the way it forces us to reflect on consciousness itself. When awareness disappears and returns, it creates a kind of natural experiment, one that reveals the scaffolding behind your thoughts. It shows how much depends on fragile systems, how much of life is constructed internally, and how easily that construction can pause. When people reflect on these moments of vanished awareness, of slipping into a gap that offers no sensations, no images, no narrative, they often describe the return as strangely profound, not because of what they experienced inside the absence, but because of how it reframes everything that comes after. The quiet minutes following a seizure or blackout, the moments when awareness begins reassembling itself, feel heavier, slower, more deliberate. It's as if the mind has been reminded of something fragile yet essential, that consciousness isn't guaranteed, that it can step away without warning, and that waking life is built on the balance of countless processes you rarely notice. The ending of a blackout is often described as a moment of awakening into confusion. People mention feeling halfway between two states that don't blend. There's this peculiar sensation of being both present and unreachable, as if the world is trying to rush in but can't quite connect. Light seems too bright, voices are muffled or distorted, faces look unfamiliar even when they shouldn't. It is a state of awareness without orientation, consciousness without full context. This is the mind's reconstruction phase, the period where everything is coming back online, but not synchronously. Memory stabilizes slowly. Sense of place returns in pieces. Emotional grounding takes even longer. These moments reveal something important about how awareness works. It's not a single thing that turns on all at once. It's a layered phenomenon. First, you gain the feeling of, I am here. Then the ability to recognize your surroundings. Then the coherence to interpret events. Only later does the emotional understanding of what happened settle in. Each person's experience of this reconstruction is different, but many describe a deep instinct towards stillness. The mind seems to crave a moment of pause, a moment to reorient itself to the body, to the space around it, to the world that continued moving while the sense of self stepped away. In that pause, people often report feeling oddly detached from fear, not because nothing frightening happened, but because the mind isn't yet capable of attaching emotion to the event. Emotion is one of the last systems to fully reboot, but once the emotional center catches up, that's when the weight appears. Some people feel an unsettling sense of vulnerability, realizing there were minutes or moments where the world was happening around them and they couldn't witness or respond to it. Others feel a sense of awe, an awareness of how strange it is that consciousness can blink out and return so seamlessly. A few feel a renewed appreciation for the act of simply being awake, grounded, and aware. What's fascinating is that many people describe this return as being accompanied by a sense of quiet. Even if the room is loud, even if people are talking or moving, the first moments of regaining awareness feel internally silent. It's as if the mind hasn't fully reconnected to its own thoughts. There's no inner dialogue, no mental noise, no worries rushing in, just presence, raw and uncomplicated. This inner silence is something consciousness researchers find particularly interesting. It suggests that the internal monologue, the voice you think with, is not a default feature of consciousness, but a layer that's added only once certain brain networks begin interacting in a stable way. The simple state of being awake emerges first, then the ability to experience sensations, then recognition, and only after that does the narrative voice return. In this way, the recovery from a blackout mirrors the building blocks of consciousness itself. As the mind moves through these stages and pieces come together, something else happens in parallel, a subtle but powerful emotional phenomenon known as experiential discontinuity. This is the feeling that life has a gap in it, that there is a missing segment of existence that cannot be recovered. This can sometimes lead to introspection, to the strange sense of having stepped outside of one's own timeline and then dropped back in. Unlike sleep, where you drift and dream and move through stages of memory and emotion, these blank spans have no progression. They don't feel like time passed, they feel like time ceased. And because of that, returning to consciousness often brings a heightened awareness of time itself. People notice the clock, they notice the light in the room, they notice how the air feels against their skin. These ordinary moments feel unusually vivid, as if the brain is grasping for sensory anchors to re-establish continuity. Every detail becomes a point of reference, a reassurance that the world is still here and that the self is still capable of experiencing it. This clarity doesn't always last long, but its presence reveals just how differently the mind behaves when it transitions out of absence. If you've ever stepped out of a dark room into sudden sunlight, you know the sensation of your eyes adjusting. How the world looks too bright at first, then gradually begins to make sense. Returning from a blackout is like that, but internally awareness adjusts. Identity readjusts. Perception reorders itself. It leads to an intriguing question. If consciousness can stop so abruptly and restart so completely, then what happens to the idea of the self during that gap? Where does the sense of I go? Some people assume it disappears like a candle blown out. Others imagine that a deeper layer persists, a quiet core of selfhood that isn't dependent on moment-to-moment awareness. This is a question that crosses the boundary between neuroscience and philosophy, and no single answer satisfies everyone. From a scientific perspective, the simplest explanation is that the conscious self pauses. But from an experiential viewpoint, people often describe something more nuanced. They say the return feels like waking into themselves again, not becoming someone entirely new. This implies that some aspects of identity remain dormant rather than erased. The sense of who you are, your personality, your preferences, your history, all seem to remain intact even when consciousness steps away entirely. That raises a compelling possibility. Perhaps identity is stored in the structure of the brain, not in active thought. Like a seed that remains itself even when it isn't growing, the self may be something that rests quietly in the machinery of the mind until consciousness returns and animates it again. The physical substrate of who you are remains, ready to spark back to life. This perspective becomes even more interesting when you consider what happens emotionally after these events. Many people describe a lingering strangeness, not necessarily fear, but an awareness that something fundamental about their perception has been revealed to them. They've seen the boundary between presence and absence, and once you've seen it, you can't completely forget it. It becomes a part of how you understand yourself. For some, this awareness brings clarity. It makes them more present in their daily life. They notice the small details more vividly, appreciate simple experiences more deeply, and feel attuned to the fragility of awareness. They don't take the ability to think and observe for granted. It becomes something precious. Others feel more contemplative, wondering what consciousness truly is if it can vanish without leaving behind even a shadow. They ask themselves where they went, even though the scientific answer is that they weren't anywhere at all. These reflections can lead people to think deeply about the nature of awareness and whether it's something produced moment by moment or something that exists more continuously. And then there are those who feel comforted by the idea that the mind can enter such profound silence and return unscathed. They see it as a reminder that consciousness is resilient, that it can go quiet and still emerge again whole. In a strange way, this can make the experience empowering rather than frightening. As the mind fully reassembles and the world settles into clarity again, another detail often emerges: a strong desire to rest. Even though the person may not remember anything that happened during the blackout or seizure, the brain has expended tremendous energy trying to regain balance and order. This exhaustion isn't emotional, it's neurological. The networks responsible for awareness have been disrupted and rebuilt. The body has navigated stress even if the mind didn't witness it. This is why the period following these episodes often feels like stepping out of a storm into quiet air. The body knows it has been through something, even though the conscious mind does not. And in that recognition, there is a kind of calm, an instinct that it's time to slow down, breathe, and allow everything to synchronize again. These moments of rest are where the emotional significance of the experience often settles. Some people cry without knowing why. Others feel peaceful. Some feel grateful. A few feel detached, as though still half outside themselves. But eventually, the mind stabilizes, the world becomes familiar again, and life resumes its rhythm.